We're fortunate tonight to have Bill Palmer with us, and Bill is really part of our living history here, and his work had a lot to do with founding Ampex, and also Bill had a great deal to do with 16 millimeter film and its current state, and he's continuing to do a lot, and that's what he's going to do here tonight. Bill, a pleasure to introduce you. I feel honored to know you. Thank you.
When Vern asked me to go into my past history and talk about the start of my activity in film work, and I started to think about it, I thought, well, gee, this is going to sound an awful lot like an obituary because it goes back quite a bit. In fact, the first piece of film that I'm going to show I made 64 years ago. So I got to thinking about my first interest in film, which was a little bit before that. I first got interested in movies because in grammar school, about the 7th grade, I was given a toy projector, which was popular in those days. This would have been about 1922. I remember it was a time that Harding and Cox were fighting for the presidency of the United States. And this toy projector was a 35 millimeter hand crank projector made by the Keystone Company in Boston. And it had with it 3 100-foot rolls, about 100 feet, of 35 millimeter film. Now, I have no surety that those 3 rolls of film were nitrate, but I think they were. It's sort of like giving a kid a can of gasoline and a cigarette lighter and say, hey, have fun, Phil. I'm sure I had a guardian angel that was overworking because it was a very short time before I found that I could buy whole 1,000-foot reels of beat-up film from Film Row for $2.50 a 1,000 feet. That the perforations were in such bad condition that they couldn't run them in theaters anymore, so they would sell them off. And I would cut the good parts out and put them through this little toy projector. The toy projector didn't have enough heat in the lamp to actually start a fire, 100-watt ordinary pear-shaped bulb. But it took me a very short time to find from my friendly electrical house that I could get a 400-watt stereopticon bulb, which would put the nitrate film on fire in about 4 seconds if I stopped cranking. So why we never had cremation of some 20 of my neighborhood kids on the top of my father's barn, I don't know. Well, it was a garage in those days. I'm not quite that old. We had gotten into the automobile age by there. But I got interested in this to the extent that I was interested in getting catalogs. I found I could get a catalog from Bass Camera Company of cameras, which seemed to me quite reasonable price. I remember there was a German camera that I could get for $90, and I was working on my father to try and get that for me so I could make my own pictures. But my father, who was in the machine shop and foundry business, said he couldn't afford that, but he said, you know about, you can make this projector work, can't you make your own camera? So I said, well, I guess I could. And he said, well, I will, if you draw out the parts you need, I will have them made in my shop. So in the period of my first 2 years in high school, I made my own 35 millimeter camera. Now about this time, Kodak brought out 16 millimeter film, 1923. I was graduated from grammar school in 24, so I entered Palo Alto High School 24 to 28. And that was the time when I really got involved in film work. I had seen some 16 millimeter, but to me this was just amateur stuff. And in fact, as most of you do know, Kodak had never made any intention of providing 16 millimeter for more than just home use. There was no intention to make it a professional medium. So for the first few years, until I got through high school, I was interested in 35 millimeter with a fond idea that maybe I would be able to take a few pictures and maybe there'd be a catastrophe or something that I could cover in the Palo Alto area and sell it to the newsreels. I did, as a matter of fact, make one little piece about 50 feet long of a local fire that took place. Somebody's garage was burning down, and it was a hot day in summer, so I was processing my own film. I also was using positive film to record on almost all the time because it was only 1 cent a foot, whereas negative film was 5. And so I, of course, could shoot more film if I used positive film as a negative. But my real thrill came at my senior year in high school when a friend of mine asked if I could make what in effect was a short advertising a carnival that the Palo Alto High School put on every spring. As a matter of fact, just at about this time of year. The carnival was May 2nd of 1928. So I made a little film running about a minute, and my friend was the publicity chairman for this thing, and he had made arrangements with the theater manager of the new Stanford Theater in Palo Alto on University Avenue. Many of you know that that theater has just recently been completely rebuilt by Dave Packard, son of Dave Packard of Hewlett-Packard, and is now just as it was when it was opened up in 1925 and was a highlight of Palo Alto. And I was an attendant there as often as I could. And of course, all silent pictures with the mighty Wurlitzer organ accompanying it. Played by a young man at that time, I guess he was about 25 years old, by the name of Albert Lachelle. Very fine organist. And so when I found out that my short, which I developed and printed in my little basement laboratory that I had at that time, was going to be shown, of course, I wanted to go in and see it. I was great expected anticipation to see my little film on the big screen. And I forgot about it for many years until about 15 years ago, this fellow who had made the arrangements, my pal from high school years, who had been in the radio business for many years, known as P.D. Worth. His real name was Ernie Whitney. He said, "You know that film you made?" He said, "I never brought it back to you, and I ran across it the other day." I said, "Well, have you opened the can?" "Yes." "Did it smell bad?" "No." "Was it red powder?" "No." He said, "It looks all right." I said, "Well, if it doesn't smell bad, it's probably okay." Now, this was a film that was about 60 years old. Nitrate film, as you know, usually disintegrates after 25 or 30 years, but for some reason or other, this roll of film was fine. This was a print. So he said, "Could you make a 16 millimeter copy of it?" I said, "Yeah, I sure do. I'd be glad to do it. I'll make one for you, and I'd like to make one for myself." So I did that. I did find that the reason he wanted to have a print for himself is that there's a girl shown in the film that was the most beautiful girl in Palo Alto High School, who he found out is now a widow and has a fine arts store down in Beverly Hills. And he thought with a copy of the film, he might be able to renew an acquaintance. So that was the trade. So to as a whim, I brought the 16 millimeter print of that film, which was at least 60 years old before I made the 16 millimeter reduction. So that will be the start. It's very short, but it will give me a chance to relive one of my biggest thrills when at the New Stanford Theater in 1928, this film was shown, and a surprise came to me, and you'll see that. Let's go. Well, the big surprise and thrill for me was that Elbert Lachelle, the minute he saw that first "It Will Amaze You," just automatically he started the organ going. And of course, what you hear here is not the actual recording. At that time, we had no means of recording it, but it was a record that I put in to simulate the way it was presented on the big screen. Well, reminiscing of that started me thinking a little bit about the start of the film business. Both 16 millimeter and 35. It's a little interesting to remind people, I had to remind myself, that the film business, the theatrical business at the end of World War I, 1918, didn't really amount to very much. Very crude pictures, short pictures, and shown mostly in small theaters, just converted stores. The interval between 1918, the end of World War I, and 1928, when the talkies really took over and spelt the end of the silent film era, was only 10 years, during which time the entire super movie palace business developed, Hollywood developed, the silent movie era, all done by a group of immigrants who were relatives for the most part, Carl Laemmle, Louis B. Mayer, those people who were chased really to the West Coast by the Motion Picture Patents Company, which were dominated by Edison. Because these people had the ability and the idea of making a film business, but they didn't have the money. So instead of paying the royalties that the Motion Picture Patents people wanted, they would have somebody make them a camera of some sort, and they'd go ahead and make pictures anyway. Motion Picture Patents Company, as I think you've all have heard somewhere, tried by legal means to stop them from using these bootleg cameras, but they'd go ahead anyway. So goon squads were hired to just seize the cameras and break them up. So when Cecil B. DeMille found that California, particularly the southern part of the state, the Hollywood area, was not only a good climatic area, but it was far enough away from the motion picture patents goon squads and was near enough to Mexico to get away from them, that really established Hollywood. But that entire, and of course the part of these same people who were friends and relatives for the most part, had the show business end of it. Roxy was the foremost, who had the big theaters in the New York area. And he devised the idea of putting on stage shows, making more than just a film. But until the sound came in, those people had the silent film. Now, thinking back to my experience here with the Stanford Theater, this restored, beautifully refixed theater, Dave Packard, is specializing on as many silent films as he can find to show, and he's also working with UCLA to make new prints of some of them. And he's installed another new old Wurlitzer organ, which is even better than the one that was originally there. And he's putting on nightly shows. If he can't get silent films, they're the early talking pictures. And it's a wonderful experience to see what the movie palaces were of that era. Well, I'm digressing a little bit but there was an overlap there in my interest in the Stanford Theater, which was opened in 1925 because of my interest in the 35, but 16 millimeter had gotten going again. By the time I was entering Stanford, I finally had to admit that 16 millimeter had some merit. In fact, I was surprised at how much better quality I could get from buying a roll of 16 millimeter reversal film and sending it to 241 Battery Street at the Kodak plant than the best of my processing in my home laboratory in 35 millimeter. I think this copy is not too bad. It's better than some I had because some of my originals. This, of course, had to be run on negative film. One of the few times I saved up enough money to be able to buy enough film because I had to work indoors and with the lighting effect. But during my early days at Stanford, studying engineering, I got interested in the sound aspect because just as I was finishing high school, sound had come in. And I happened to meet a chap who was just finishing Stanford at that time, somebody who followed in the movie business, and many of you knew to a degree, and that's Cliff Skinner. He was an electrical engineer taking an engineering degree, and one of the few students of Terman, who was the one member of the faculty that was teaching electronics in the early tube days. Skinner was doing some research work. He devised an oscillator, and I met him and was asking him a few questions about the possibility of making a sound recorder. He had a couple of oscillographs that were used in laboratory work that was in Stanford, and he and I looked at them with the idea of possibly adapting these oscillographs, which were intended to record electrical phenomena, into a method of putting sound on film. About the same time, I also met one of the early newsreel photographers who's still alive in his 90s, Frank Vail. And he had just gotten a 35 millimeter camera equipped with the early type of single system glow tube, which wasn't working very well. And he and his partner, a man by the name of Schwartz, they called themselves Schwartz and Vail, were trying to get some improvements. And they heard about Skinner to get him to use his oscillator to see what was wrong with this glow tube. From that, and looking at the oscillographs that were at the lab at Stanford, I got the idea of possibly making my own sound recorder. I also worked with Skinner to make the prototype of his first recorder, which he later actually designed and built and sold several of them. I don't know how many he actually did, but he sold 2 to China. It's significant because he was the first one that I know of that took what in effect was a Western Electric light valve, 2 ribbons, which, as you know, in the Western Electric light valve is the ribbons that go together and the light shining through makes a variable density track. But Skinner and I moved it up at 90 degrees and made a bilateral variable area recording of that. I don't remember that either Skinner or I thought at all of exploring to see whether it was a patentable idea. And Skinner went ahead, as I say, and made it itself. I hadn't finished school, so I had no particular interest in following through with it. But it did whet my appetite, so I continued to work on my own. But I had made a sound recorder which made use of the mirror-type galvanometer, which seemed to me to have easier possibilities, similar to the RCA. And about 1933, I was about halfway through school, and I got the 16 millimeter sound recorder working, which did pretty well. And at that time, the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge was well underway. And I met a chap who was working for Columbia Steel Company, the largest steel contractor on the Bay Bridge. The towers were well underway at this time, and there was a chap who was in high school, about 17 years old, by the name of Peter Stackpole. The name I'm sure many of you heard of recently. He was a still photographer, son of Ralph Stackpole, who was a famous sculptor and did the sculptures at the head of the stock exchange in San Francisco. Peter had gotten permission to go out on the bridge with the steel workers and climb along the steelwork with a Leica. This was when 35 millimeter photography was considered very amateur stuff, that you couldn't do serious work with it. But Peter, with the ability that he had and his artistic heritage, got some remarkably fine still pictures. And then one day he borrowed a Bell & Howell 70 camera and shot about 400 feet of film up on the steel towers, which were equally spectacular, and showed them to the officials of the Columbia Steel Company. And they got the idea, including this younger chap who I became acquainted with, a chap by the name of Joe Best. Why shouldn't they make a record in 16 millimeter film of the building of the San Francisco Bay Bridge? Peter Stackpole was not particularly interested in carrying through with that, and in the movie end, he just did it because it was interesting. The material was unfortunately shot at 16 frames a second, so it was a little bit jerky. And being a still man, he had no idea of having any cutaways to be able to make a continuity, but it was spectacular material to begin with. But I also had cameras, and I had a sound recording outfit that worked. So the end result was I dropped out of Stanford for a couple of years while I made a film on the Bay Bridge. This took about 2 years. And I covered particularly the cable spinning and finishing up operations. But then I came to the point of how do we make prints of this? It was one thing to record rolls of Cinekodak film and send it to Battery Street for processing, and the quality was very good. And I could make soundtracks, but how did I get the two put together? No labs in San Francisco had any equipment of that sort as yet. So I inquired a bit, and I fortunately came across a chap who later became my partner, Dave Butler. Many of you remember him, who with me formed Palmer and Company, which later became my corporation. And he was working for Del Monte, and he had worked with the Dunning Company in Hollywood. Dunning was a process company. They did special work for superimposers and one thing and another. And Dodge Dunning, the son of the proprietor, was a very resourceful young fellow, and he had done some experimental work, both in still pictures with fine grain, and at that time the great thing for development of miniature negatives was paraphenylene diamine, which is a type of developer that has a very fine grain. It's, as I understand it, it creates a sort of a dye. It's not unlike the present color developers that we use for color film now. But he was able to develop ordinary positive stock to make an inner negative from it and keep the contrast low and find the grain fine enough. And through the Dunning people, we were able to work out a technique whereby I was able to put this Columbia Steel Company film of the Bay Bridge to bed, so to speak. I made quite a number of prints of the finished film. It was a fairly long film, ran about 5 reels. But the most significant thing, as far as I was concerned, is that I felt that since I was had a sound recording device, as my sound.
You lost your sound, your PA.
I wonder whether that's. Hello? Has it come up again? We put a new battery in it, so it should. Well, I'll talk a little louder, maybe, and I better shut up. I think it's trying to tell me something.
It just cut out again.
There's a mute here, but I don't think I have that on. Hello? Now back? Maybe somehow or other the mute got. I wasn't touching it, I don't think, but I might have. These technical things get.
Don't move.
Don't move. Okay. All right. The film on the Bay Bridge, the prints that we made, are now 57 years old. I have parts of one of the first prints. All of the completed prints have long since been lost. The steel company, you wore them out, I guess, except that 2 or 3 years ago, during the 50th anniversary of the building of the bridge, the local TV stations were covering it quite a bit, and Channel 2 received a call from a woman who said her husband had been an engineer on the Bay Bridge, and she had a can of film that had been laying around for a long time, and it said it was building the Bay Bridge. Would you being Channel 2 she was talking to, would you be interested in looking at it? They said yes, we certainly would. So she brought it down to them. Channel 2 made a 3/4 inch cassette of it and gave it back to her. This was almost a year before the final celebration of the 50th anniversary of the building of the bridge. Nobody kept a record of who that woman was or where she was. So somewhere in the East Bay there is a complete print of that film. The rest of it is only the pieces that I have, which were really out some of the early stages of it. But what I've done is to take part of the more interesting, to me, phases of the bridge, because I felt then, and I still do in a lot of things, that if you have the ability to record sound, it's highly desirable to record the sound that goes with the picture. In other words, to give you the feeling you are there. I found that this was not as easy to do on the Building the Bay Bridge as I first thought it might be. So I had to do various ways to simulate it in one way or another, and sometimes I had to fake the sound, but most of it I made right on the job. And particularly during the cable spinning operations, I took my sound outfit, which was by this time what I called a single double system. The sound recorder made a separate film from the camera being a Cine Special, run by a common motor, which was battery operated. It made the total outfit weighed about 200 pounds, consisting of a large tripod and batteries, storage battery for the motor, B batteries for the amplifier. Amplifier, incidentally, made by a young chap I met who was going to Santa Clara. The young chap was Jack Mullen, a name that I'm sure many of you have heard, and later had quite a bit of work having to do with magnetic tape after the war. So I have parts of this film, which is 57 years old, and this is the original print, made on Kodak reversal, a duplicate negative made on ordinary Kodak positive, developed by the magic of Dunning's messing around with chemicals, with paraphenyl and diamine. That's about the most I know of it. And you'll see what we were able to get. The soundtrack, as I say, was simulating live sound in many cases, but actual live sound in many others. So let's roll the Bay Bridge film.
In 1933, work began on the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, the largest bridge in the world. Excavations were made for a cable anchorage in San Francisco. Ferry boat commuters saw the end of a dock torn away to make room for a bridge tower as the old regime made way for the new. The bridge towers rose like magic as the tasks outlined by men of science were accomplished by men of action. No tribute is too great to pass on to these daring bridgemen who daily risk their lives in their hazardous business hundreds of feet above San Francisco Bay. Hanging on in precarious positions, these men guided the steel members expertly into the structure, placing their faith in the signal men who controlled the movement of the hoisting machinery. And this faith was well justified by these other bridgemen with headsets who transmitted hoisting signals to the tower base. These signal men were chosen for their cool heads and steady nerves. While the bridgemen work on this tower, let's go back to the American Bridge Company's headquarters on the San Francisco waterfront as Big Jim Ward, superintendent of construction, checks in with resident engineer McKean.
Yeah. Sure. Make it today sometime. All right, I'll be seeing you. Well, Jimmy, you think you could finish that tower this week?
Yes. The tower is going up very fast. Putting up a barge load a day. Take a look.
Let's get them falls down and get hooked on. What do you say up there? Let's go up with that. Jack, send up that barrel of drift pins. Okay. Well, we'll have to ride it up there and clear that hammerhead block.
Now we are on top of the steel tower, 500 feet above the water, where the catwalk rope is drawn back after being secured to the center anchorage. This provides enough slack to allow the end to be made fast to the tower, and as each rope is cut to exact length before hoisting, this one will be in perfect alignment when the slack is released. Next came the placing of the catwalk flooring. This lift, on its way to the tower top, is folded together now, but when stretched out over the ropes will cover a distance of 100 feet. This catwalk floor was made of United States steel cyclone chain link fence. Steel fencing was chosen for its light weight, low wind resistance, and great strength. It furnished a firm, safe footing for the bridgeman after it had been guyed with storm cables. After each lift was landed on a small platform under the catwalk ropes, it was bolted onto the ropes and pushed out to make room for the next lift. This job called for iron nerves, for it was necessary that bridgemen ride down the catwalk during the stretching. With nothing between them and the bay but the sliding catwalk floor, they were right at home and went about the work as casually as if it were a good sidewalk beneath them. Nevertheless, it was a job for a sure foot, and that is something that every bridgeman prides himself on. After the precarious footing during tower erection, this 10-foot wide catwalk floor was a cinch. Now, here's something that reminds us of when we used to jump on the bed springs. Only if we missed, it only meant a fall to the floor. But these boys don't miss because it would mean a drop of 300 feet into San Francisco Bay. Although we secretly feel that they enjoyed this bouncing up and down, it was done for a serious purpose, the flooring sliding freely as it was stretched over the ropes. San Francisco Bay looked like this to the bridgemen perched on the catwalk. The old ferry boats plowed stolidly along far below as a new method of transportation reared up above them. Up here in the air, a roadway was being flung out through space, high and dry and large enough to accommodate all bay traffic for centuries to come. The bridgemen had something to stand on now and were impatient to get at the job of cable spinning. Not only wide enough to walk on, the catwalk was wide enough to run on, too, and what a way to work up an appetite for dinner. When it was time to go home to dinner, these bridgemen just took the sky ride, transferred to the escalator, and piled down helter-skelter. Getting down was the main thing, and nobody seemed to care how. The thought of a nice warm dinner at home was a real inspiration. Dirty, tired, and hungry. But these boys got real pleasure from leaning back in the launch and looking up at their handiwork. Tired out all right, but they were bridge builders, and they felt that theirs was the most worthwhile job in the world. The bridge began to take shape with sweeping lines of catwalks forming a continuous link over nearly 2 miles of deep water. Up on the structure, bridgemen were moving about busy as ants on the catwalks, towers, and anchorages to make ready for the cable spinning. With increasing tempo on this last lap of the work, the strands piled up more rapidly than ever, and at the island anchorage, the wheels plunged downward at a sharp angle and appeared to bury themselves in the ground. Let's climb down in there and see what happens when the wheels stop. Perhaps you've been thinking that the peculiar clanking noise of the spinning wheel sounded like a cowbell. Well, you were right, because that's just what it was. One would think the engineers on a job of this size would get their heads together and work out some fancy kind of signal to warn workers along the catwalk of the spinning wheel's approach. But it seems that somebody brought up a homely old cowbell one day and tied it onto the spokes of the spinning wheel. Strangely enough, it worked like a charm, and soon all the spinning wheels were fitted up like prize heifers. High above San Francisco Bay and over the tops of the silvery towers, the spinning wheels traveled unceasingly, building up little by little the strands of steel that were to bind together two cities.
Well, after this I was hooked and determined that 16 millimeter could be used as a professional medium. It turned out, I found soon after that there were quite a few others of my age around the country who had about the same idea. People like George Colburn in Chicago, Lloyd Thompson, who got together with a man by the name of Calvin in Kansas City, John Maurer, and his friend who designed the Oricon camera later, Eric Berndt, in New York City, all felt that the 16 millimeter medium with sound had merit. Getting back to the bridge is an interesting thing that I think you might be interested in, and that was the way of getting out on the bridge during those cable spinning operations and the showing also the letting out the catwalks. We had to go out by launch to the center anchorage, which had been completed, and then we would take the outfit. We had our total outfit, this camera and the sound recorder, weighed about 200 pounds. The two of us, Joe Best, who's the Columbia Steel employee, and I did it. We'd go into the center anchorage. Now that is a completely hollow concrete structure about the size of the Russ building, almost 20 stories high, with a steel stairway that goes up about 20 floors too. We had to carry that rig up to the top of the center anchorage to just start it on the cable quaternary curve. Then we had to climb up the catwalk, and the further you climbed, the more tired you became and the steeper it got. The last 15 or 20 feet was so steep that they put wired wooden cleats so you could, your feet wouldn't slip too much on the chain link fence, which also was made by U.S. Steel, as the narrative frequently points out. But whether it was worth all that effort, I don't know, but when you're young, you can put up with a lot. And as I say, it determined me to keep at that, so I went back to Stanford and completed my business. But in the meantime, I continued to work on my machinery. It seemed to me this cumbersome single-double system was fine. It had one advantage, that I could mark the two films and keep in sync because they were run by a common motor. But a single system would be much better. And by this time, Kodachrome had become available. And I found I could buy Kodachrome with perforations only on one side. So I made a single system 16mm camera. And what I did was to reverse the usual operation of the 35mm newsreel people. What they did in most of the newsreels was to take a wall camera, which was popular, or a Bell & Howell, or one of the regular 35mm cameras, and put a galvanometer or sound recording device of some sort. Glow tube was the first one that I mentioned that Frank Vail was working on. A rather irregular and cumbersome thing because it depended upon high voltages and it was subject apparently to vagaries of temperature and one thing and another. RC8 brought out a very good galvanometer that could be attached to regular 35mm cameras and give very good sound. In my case, I had my sound recorder in 16mm, so instead of putting a sound recorder onto a camera, I put a camera mechanism onto a sound recorder. I took the mechanism from a Model B Cine Kodak. That was the next version of their original hand-cranked Model A, and had a fairly quiet intermittent. That was a leather-covered one. And I attached that to my sound recorder and made a camera that would record sound and picture on the same film. Well, about that time, I had done several things, and somehow or other, Dr. Robert Swain of Stanford heard that I had this device, and he called me up and he said, "I understand you can record sound and picture on 16mm film." I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, we're having a celebration in front of the Memorial Church commemorating the 50th anniversary of the founding of Stanford University. Could you make a picture and sound of it?" I said, "Yes, I could." I gave him a price, which he said was okay. And I went down there and with one of my employees, in fact, my only employee at that time, Stuart McCondray, he was planning to come, and I'm afraid he may have gotten caught in the traffic. Did Stu get here? Well, at any rate, he worked for me for about 25 years until he retired a few years ago and did a great deal of the mechanical work in my studio. But he went along with a chap that I had met who had worked on the first King Kong, but was now in the display business. Stu McCondray and this chap that I speak of, King Kong thing, Orville Goldner was his name, were given two Bell & Howell cameras to shoot wild shots at a great enough distance, and I shot the participants in sound on the most film that I could get into my camera, which was 400 feet. So I had 11 minutes of lip-sync dialogue. I also had a Presto disc recorder, which I could record the entire ceremony. The whole thing only lasted about 15 minutes. So I had all the audio, and I had wild shots. And I had the major portion that they wanted to be sure and have me get was about a 10-minute speech by President Hoover. He was no longer president at that time. This was 1941. And, but they wanted his entire speech. And Ray Lyman Wilbur, the then president of the university, who was a very noted member, was going to talk, and several other people. So I made a film which I felt was a pretty good record of the ceremony and commemorates the 50th anniversary. Before I go further, I want to show two little excerpts from it, a piece of Herbert Hoover. The reason I show it is that it's the only time I've seen him on film where he is what I knew was his natural self. I had the privilege of meeting him on several occasions up at the Bohemian Grove, where he would always give the lakeside talk on the last day of the encampment. You've heard of that illustrious group of elite people who go up for 2 weeks in July in the redwoods and do things that Herb Cain likes to sneer at. But as a longtime member of the club, I assure you it's a real fun group of men devoted to literature, music, and drama, and so forth. And it is not a 2 weeks beer bust, as people imply once in a while. But Herbert Hoover had a pleasant, whimsical sense of humor. But when he was president and he got on the radio, we didn't have television, remember, in those days, he was a stuffy sounding, deadly person. For this 10 minutes, this little talk he gave, signifying the 50th anniversary, he was more what he was like among his friends. Then Ray Lyman Wilbur got up and made some remarks, which I've included in this, which he was looking ahead for the next 50 years, what Stanford might be. And he gives some warnings, which I think are very prophetic and very interesting. Let's run the portion of this 50th anniversary of the founding of Stanford.
Mr. Cutler, Dr. Wilbur, fellow men and women of Stanford, I might mention to you without undue pride that I have the dubious title of being the first resident student on this campus. Now, that timely arrival was not pure idealism. It was a practical job of cramming in an effort to get admitted at all. And I was only admitted through the imaginative minds of 2 Stanford professors. And I stood over there about 200 feet away and watched the ceremony of the opening of this university. I had at that time never listened to great speakers on public questions before, and it was all very wonderful. And it was one occasion when I was warranted in believing everything that was said. Senator Stanford expressed his hopes of the university in stirring terms. And little could he know the profound service that he was inaugurating for his country. For over these 50 years, 30,000 trained minds and strengthened characters have gone out of these doors for some part in American leadership.
The university provides a strong citadel for the protection of all that is best in the achievements of the human race. Its devotion to truth is its greatest protection, no matter what strains and stresses it may undergo. For unless the truth is discovered and prevails, our common living rests upon a fragile basis. By truth, I mean recognition and respect for those universal laws over which we have no authority. They control us, we depend upon them, but we can use them in our daily life and future advances if we know what they are and if we respect them. If the Stanford family and all other groups who know what a university education means in individual lives and in society will make the development of free universities, be they of the state or those supported by private gifts and supported also by those paying directly for some of the cost of education, if we can give to these institutions a direct life interest, then we can look to a magnificent future for our race. If the pressure of prejudice, selfishness, cupidity, and desire for control bears too heavily upon the university, it can resist only if it is supported by those willing to trust its faculty. Every great push forward of the human race has been resented and hampered by established interests and curdled thinking. Freedom, with knowledge and responsibility, is the one absolute requisite for university men and women.
That is Kodachrome, 50 years old, sound and picture on the same film. The print that you saw actually is an internegative made from it and then a positive print from it. But the original Kodachrome still has good color and sound is, as you heard it, intelligible. I had a rather interesting experience in showing this when I finished the picture and called Dr. Swain, who was acting president because Ray Lyman Wilbur had a government job. I think it was Assistant Secretary of the Commerce or something like that in Washington. And Dr. Swain I called him and he said the film was ready. He said, "Oh, fine, will you come down to the campus and show it at the Memorial Hall? We'd like to see it." And Dr. Wilbur's still here, and he would like to see it too. So I appeared at the appointed time in the morning at the Memorial Hall at Stanford, which is a large theater, as those of you who have been there. It seats a couple of thousand people with a good-sized balcony and has regular projection equipment. They had some new Bell & Howell ARC 16mm projectors. So I met Dr. Wilbur and Dr. Swain and several other people whom I don't remember, and handed them my can. There was, of course, the usual engineer major domo with his pencils on his pocket and belt full of tools. And I handed him the reel, and I said, "This is the film we want to show." He said, "Oh, Jesus, I don't know how to run those things up there." Dr. Swain had failed to ask that they have a projectionist available. So I said, "Well, I think if you have the key, let me in the booth, I could probably figure out how to make it work." So it took a little while, but I was able to find the motor generator to start, and I had worked arc projectors, so I was able to open up the little cubby holes and show the film. When I finished, rewound my film, turned on the motor generator and got everything back again, and I opened the door to the booth. It was completely dark. Nobody was around. They'd all gone away, including the engineer at the theater, forgotten all about me up there in the booth. So I had to use the Braille system of getting my way out. Fortunately, the doors, of course, had the safety catches so I could get out. So I went home, and wondering whether I'd get further word to deliver the film. I took the film back with me, sent a bill to Stanford. They paid it promptly, but I never heard from it. So I put the film on the shelf in the vault and forgot about it. Until about 30 years later, I met a fellow who was with now the president of the university, Wallace Sterling, who was a public relations man. And I said, "Oh, I'm glad to meet you. You might be interested in a film that I made 30 years ago for the university of the ceremony having to do with the founding of the university 50 years before." "Oh, I certainly would like to see that film." would you bring it down and show it to Dr. Serling and others? So I said, this time I thought, this was the original film, mind you, because it was single system. So by this time I decided I'd make a print and keep the original in my own hands. So I showed it. Dr. Sterling thought it was fine. This man was very appreciative of it. I gave him the reel and went home. Of course, they paid for the print. So another 20 years goes by. So now we're 50 years back from the making of this film. And there's a big hoopla about the 100th anniversary of the founding of Stanford University. And a little squib appears on the Palo Alto Redwood City paper that anybody who has old films or movies or whatever of the early days at Stanford, they'd like very much to get some mementos for their celebration for the 100th anniversary. So I called the number. The woman I was supposed to talk to was busy at the time, but I gave the message to the person. I said, you know, you have a film in the files of the president somewhere, a complete record of the ceremony of the 50th anniversary in which Dr. Wilbur and Herbert Hoover and others speak. Oh, that's wonderful. We certainly want to use that. So as the 100th anniversary came through and all the publicity came through, I expected somewhere they would probably announce that this wonderful historical record of 50 years back, in which President Hoover and Ray Lyman Wilbur, who was only next to Dr. Jordan, who was the first president of the university, very noteworthy in furnishing or forming the character of Stanford University. Then you can imagine my feeling when I see that the headliners of their big 100th anniversary were Whoopi Goldberg and Joan Baez. Well, I had the single system camera. By this time, Dave Butler and I had joined together, and we were making films, mostly for the food industry in Del Monte in particular, but just shortly after this 50th anniversary picture was made, Pearl Harbor occurred. This was November of '41, and December was Pearl Harbor. So the war was on. I was young enough still to be draft bait, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to stay out very long. But this chap that I mentioned, Orville Goldner, who handled one of the wild cameras, had joined the Navy. He had the credentials that were needed for the Navy Training Film Division. He had worked in Hollywood. He knew animation because he'd worked on King Kong and so forth. He had taken a master's degree in education at Stanford. He was a specialist in display work, had made a lot of displays at the 3940 Fair in Treasure Island. So the Navy, when they put through what was the early primitive forms of which now would be, of course, a computer, to find out who they had that had all the skills they needed to head up training films for the Navy. Up comes Orville Goldner. So he was immediately put into the Navy as officer in charge of training films. And given a rating, I think he was a second rear lieutenant or whatever the Navy calls, a fairly high thing. He couldn't be an admiral right off the bat, but he directed it. He immediately got in touch with us and he said, you know, we've got to have a lot of training films made for the baby flat top carriers that are being made in Sausalito. Kaiser, as you may remember, had a huge operation going within a year or so after Pearl Harbor, in which they were turning out a baby aircraft carrier a day. There were over 100 of them. Up to that time, the major aircraft carriers in the Navy, there were only 6. Each one had a special way of handling the planes worked out by that particular major aircraft carrier. Now, obviously, when they were going into the South Pacific to fight the Japanese, you couldn't have a different routine of flying and handling planes. So that the purpose of the films that they needed were to train the deck crews, as our supervisor called them, fresh-caught farm hands, who, many of them were kids only 18, 19 years old. Many of them could hardly speak English because they came from Cajun country and all sorts of weird places that didn't know much about the world until they were put in and told to learn how to handle the airplanes on the deck of these little carriers. They needed color because the costumes worn by the various members of the crew, whether they were aircraft handlers or ammunition people or firefighters or whatever, we all, including Dave Butler and I, who were still civilians, but we had to wear everything the same as the Navy people. They were just jerseys that we put on and sort of an old-fashioned aviator's type cap. But your job was signified by the color. Now, the only color films that were or color processes that were available at that time were in EVA 35 millimeter, the bipack system, which made use of two 35 millimeter films, which made a very bulky and cumbersome camera, or Technicolor, complete with 3 films and Natalie Calmus. And you couldn't very well have that out on a carrier, particularly a baby one that only had a deck 400 feet long, with a crew of, I think, pretty close to 1,000 people and 30 or 40 airplanes. So about that time, as we were waiting the contract to come through to doing Navy training films, by this time we had 2 employees, Stuart McCondry that I mentioned and Joe Dees, who was a cameraman. And Dave Butler and I were trying to get contacts and pull strings to be able to get our 2 employees deferred. But it went on, and in the meantime, Stu McCondry got a little discouraged, and he enlisted because he could get a job that was better than just taking his chances to handle a rifle on the front lines. And Joe Dees was drafted. So when we finally got the contract, it was just Dave Butler and I to do the whole thing. But we were very fortunate that we got a chap to work with who had been in the film business. He was a supervisor. He had been with MGM, a unit manager, they called him. And we also had a chap who was called a spoiler. He was a goofy guy who did everything wrong to teach these young sailors how not to do things. And he had been Clark Gable's stand-in at MGM, so he was glad to get a nice thing to do. So Dave Butler and I spent the 3 years about it took to the Navy training films, living at the Coronado Hotel and working out of San Diego with these new carriers as we would go out to sea maybe for 2 or 3 weeks shooting the pictures, then we'd come in and do it. But again, I was most anxious to keep the feeling of live sound. You are there. And we were able to sell that to the Navy people. So all of these operations on the aircraft carrier have live sound. Now, it was a little difficult, I found, to record the sound because out to sea, and particularly these baby flat tops, unless you found a wind at least 30 knots over the deck, you couldn't take off. You'd have to catapult. And the wind is not of 30 knots or so, is not conducive to putting out microphones and getting good sound. But I wanted dialogue in various things. So I got the idea of fixing up a parabolic concentrator, which I'd read about. My parabolic concentrator was the dish from an electric shin toaster type heater, the type that used to have a coil in it, about so big around, and I put that in a wooden box and dampened the metal reflector with sponge rubber glued to it, and put the mic in the focus of it, and we were able to get intelligible sound, which we then had to loop afterwards. We had to replace all the dialogue because there was two things. There was too much noise in the deck, the wind noise and the airplanes in the distance. But where we wanted the sound, we had a guide to it. So I want to show a portion of one of the pictures that we made on arresting gear, which have the live sound, and I think you might find it rather interesting.
Let's watch this carrier in operation.
Stand by to land aircraft. All unauthorized personnel, keep clear of the gallery walkway.
Spoilers! Get the hell out of that hatchway. If a plane comes in, that's where I'm going to duck.
Guys, click on me for you guys.
Flight deck officer signals deck clear, which is repeated at the landing signal platform. First plane is in the groove. Steady. There's the cut. Hook catches cross-deck pennant and plane comes to a stop. Hook release men disengage the pennant. Hook is retrieved and the plane taxis forward across the barrier. First barrier up, deck clear, second barrier up, third barrier up, and then first barrier down. Using number one barrier in this manner speeds up operation. Crewmen duck clear in case the cross-deck pennant parts. As the plane stops, lift valve setting is quickly changed to speed up retrieving. Yielding elements are raised to lift the pennant clear. Plane taxis across the barriers, number one up, and the deck is ready for the next plane. Number two up, number three, and then number one down. Okay, cut. Pilot holds off and into the barrier. Crash crews are alert. Firefighters, asbestos suit men to get the pilot, and plane handlers and corpsmen converge on the plane. Barriers are cleared and inspected for any broken strands and wires.
It was very difficult, apparently, to eliminate it because the process of reconciling these varying frequencies is to record on a special 16 millimeter camera that takes a full 30th of a second. In other words, the shutter opens for a 30th of a second, or in terms of rotation of the shutter, it's 288 degrees. And then it closes and allows a half of a field to go by. That would be 1/20th of a second. And then it would open up again and take another whole 30th of a second. So you would be able to leave out every frame a half a field. And the problem of combining the upper half of one field with the lower half of another field was the problem of this shutter bar. So it seemed to me that there was a way of helping this out by using a sort of a fade-in, fade-out, by putting the shutter in the optical system so that as the shutter was closing off the light from one frame and opening the other, it would make, in effect, a sort of a miniature lap dissolve. So I made up a camera in this case, right after the war, we couldn't get metals yet, so I made my camera box out of masonite and gave it a crackle finish. It looked all right. And the mechanism of that camera was a Bell & Howell projector, which has a rather fast pull down, because with a wide open shutter of 288 degrees, plus additional time that I had to have to make this phasing out, required even more time. So I had to have a very rapid pull down, and I devised a camera which worked quite well. And I found that I had a tremendous cooperation on the part of the TV stations in San Francisco. All three of the KCBS, ABC, and KRON were very helpful to me, allowing me to go in and photograph test material. And I got pictures that really looked much better than I'd seen coming from the East Coast. One of the people who happened to see one of my test runs that I think it was an SMPTE meeting, I'm not sure, but I ran some test material, but the producer of the Standard Hour happened to see it and thought this was not bad. The Standard Hour was a symphony program that had been sponsored by Standard Oil of California for about 25 years on radio. But with television coming on, and particularly with Ed Sullivan on Sunday night, directly opposite a radio show with fine music, they knew that their radio show was dead. So they thought, well, why not put a fine music program on television? Investigating shooting movies, that was far too expensive. There was no such thing as even microwave hookup for the various stations. It had to be put on film somehow or other to be released for Standard Oil in their territory, 11 western states. They had to release it on at least 6 stations. So I showed what I could do, and we talked over with their musical director, which was Carbon Dragon, and they decided to appropriate enough money to make an experimental series. ABC, in the form of KGO, were interested in cooperation, so they furnished their entire remote facilities, consisting of a remote truck with 4 cameras. We went over to the Richmond Auditorium on several occasions. We'd spend about 4 days at a time shooting parts of this. It wasn't entirely a symphony program because they had operatic numbers and soloists of instrumentalists and so forth. They decided to mix it up. The idea was to make it closed circuit onto film ahead of time. We've spent a whole year making the various parts and then assembled them to make a 13 weeks series of half-hour programs. I also found that one of the problems with the quality at that time of the so-called kinescope recording was the iconoscope tube that was still being used to play back the film on the air. The image orthicons had been developed, and they had much better quality, but they weren't so suitable for film transmission. The iconoscope, on the other hand, was the first one to be devised for film playback on the air, but it had a very bad habit that anything in the dark, large areas of black or dark, would flare. And this was completely opposite to what Standard Oil wanted in showing some of their operatic things, where, for instance, in La Boheme, it's set in Paris at night, looking out over the streets of Paris with the smoke coming out of the chimneys and so forth. If you put a scene like that on an iconoscope, it just would flare and look terrible. We saw this on Ed Sullivan's show. Whenever it was a stage show in New York, and as soon as the lights dimmed and they put a spotlight on Ed Sullivan, the kinescope that we would see out on the West Coast, the background would just go completely bluey and gray, and Ed Sullivan would be washed out and you couldn't see his face. So I did find out that every once in a while they would do what they called a quick kine. They didn't have time to develop and make a print, so they would develop and put the negative on the air in the iconoscope and flip a switch, which all iconoscopes had, to turn the negative image into a positive, and the quality of the blacks were just fine. So I reversed the procedure of the normal kinescope process by shooting on reversal film, which was my favorite film anyhow, because as you know, those of us who went through the old black and white days, reversal process of itself has inherent fine grain, much finer than the old negative positive before fine grain negatives had been developed. The reason being, of course, that the graininess of film and speed go hand in hand. So in developing Kodak cine film, for instance, it was very successful in the early days because the negative, which was developed up first, had all the coarse grain, which were the more sensitive ones, to form the negative image. That is bleached out and destroyed. What's left on the film then is fine grain. So that's why reversal films in those early days always looked better than negative positive. Maybe that's a technical detail that you'd like to know. At any rate, I shot all this material for the Standard Hour on reversal, and then our prints were just simply printed to positive. And so it gave a negative image, and that was put on the iconoscope, flipped the switch to reverse the polarity, and the quality was surprisingly good. I have a little piece that will show you what the negative, this is an actual part of one of our release prints, a little scene from La Boheme with Dorothy Warenshold, and it'll show you what the negative looked like. And then following it will be just a little bit of a positive, which was printed going so that you could see on the screen what the quality, as near as I can simulate it, looked like on the air. Incidentally, the show was very successful in an audience standpoint. It won the Peabody Award. In 13 weeks, Standard developed a bigger audience than they developed in 25 years on their radio show. And yet, unfortunately, this show did not continue because the president of Standard Oil at that time didn't like music. Let's show a piece of the Standard Hour. My fault. I forgot. This is the Japanese
Better here as the father of the Japanese peace treaty.
This was a newsreel. I'll get to we'll go right into the Standard Hour afterwards. This is kinescope too, done on reversal film, and this is a piece of the original reversal, which was recorded at KPIX.
Secretary of State Dean Acheson puts his name to the Japanese peace treaty, in the name of the United States. And now the name of John Foster Dulles is inscribed in the treaty that he wrote more than any other man.
You may recognize the voice of a young man at that time, Walter Cronkite.
The Japanese are signing a 6,000-word treaty that brings them to peace with the other nations of the world, excepting those who have refused to sign this treaty: Russia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, India, Burma, Yugoslavia. A treaty far more liberal in its terms than even the Japanese dared to dream. In 1947, they agreed on minimum terms that they thought necessary for Japan to restore her sovereignty, minimum terms she wanted in a Japanese peace treaty, and those terms were not nearly so liberal as the terms she finally achieved today in what the Free Nations call a Treaty of Reconciliation, an expression of a realization that the harsh treaties of victor over vanquished in the past have never prevented further war, only incensed the feelings, nationalistic feelings of beaten nations, and led to further war. Signing now, Muniyoshi Tokugawa, member of the House of Councilors of Japan. The last signature of the Japanese peace treaty, Hisato Ichimata, Governor of the Bank of Japan.
Now keep on going right into the standard hour.
This hour is yours, the Standard Hour. Good evening, and welcome to the Standard Hour, a program of fine music designed for your enjoyment and presented by the Standard Oil Company of California. From the world's treasury of songs, symphonies, operas, ballets, and other musical masterpieces, we have fashioned these concerts for you. Our soloists are among the finest instrumentalists, vocalists, and dancers. And the Standard Symphony Orchestra plays under the baton of the distinguished young American conductor, Carmen Dragon. Opera lovers will recall the familiar setting of Puccini's opera La Bohème, Paris in the 90s. The Garrett Studios of Montmartre, beneath cloudy skies on Christmas Eve. Behind glowing studio windows, life and warmth. In the studio of the poet Rudolph is a young seamstress who has come to his door seeking assistance. Captivated by her frail beauty, he asks her who she is. Mi chiamano Mimi. They call me Mimi, she replies, and she tells him of her life.
better look at my notes so I don't skip something else. The Japanese peace treaty, of course, is a very interesting commentary in view of what's happened since then. I was employed to do that for release at station KING in Seattle. And I recorded it courtesy of KPIX, had it processed right away and sent it up to Seattle so it could be shown just a few hours later. Getting back to the Standard Hour, during the production of the film, I was very concerned about musical quality of 16mm film. By this time, we were well into magnetic recording. Carmen Dragon, who was the conductor, was used to music work in Hollywood, and he realized that when you do musical things, songs and so forth, it's very difficult to do a sequence with shots, doing your actual recording and getting the picture right at the same time. So in Hollywood, it's inevitably pre-scored. That is, you record the music first, and then the performers sing with themselves back. So right at the start, Carmen Dragon said, we must do that in here. So that's the way we did it. We recorded first at NBC studio on quarter-inch tape and on Ampex. At that time, NBC was the parent company there. ABC, which is KGO, was a tenant. And there was a bit of an embarrassment there where Standard Oil insisted that they didn't want to use some brand new RCA tape machines that they had gotten. They had to have Ampex. So they forced NBC to buy 2 Ampex 300 machines to do the audio. When the quarter-inch tape was then edited, Carmen Dragon and I taking the good takes, I transferred the quarter-inch tape to perforated magnetic film, which is the first synchronous magnetic film with perforations that I know of that had been made. Since I got the experimental electronics from the first Model 300 Ampex that was the prototype had been finished, and Poniatov, who was a good friend of mine by this time, said, let Palmer have that, and along with some heads from the Ampex. So I built up a synchronous recorder. And as we did the pictures in the Richmond Auditorium, we were playing back the magnetic perforated film, and of course the camera, having a synchronous motor, would be in step with it. And most of the performers had no trouble at all lip syncing, because of course they were singing with themselves. Dorothy Warnschultz, shown here, was particularly good at that. If you watch her lip motion, there was just no way you could detect any lack of trouble. We did have one man, though, a beautiful voice, a baritone, and he was not too sharp. He just insisted upon waiting until he heard his voice before he started to sing with it, and he was always just a little behind, to the point that Adrian Michaelis, who was the head of the whole show, came to me and said, what are we going to do? And I said, well, everything is going well. He's consistent at least, but so let's go ahead and record it, which I did. Then when I started to put it together, I dropped the soundtrack back 3 frames, and it came in perfect sync. He was always 3 frames late. Well, this goes back still quite a few years. 39 years ago, if you want to be precise. Big question that comes to mind, well, have you done anything in the last 30 years or so? Well, yeah. We've been in business doing various things in the standard way of post-production. About the time this was done, in the 53 was the date that the Standard Hour came on the air. By that time, the industry had changed somewhat. There were quite a few entrepreneurs who had set themselves up as film producers, who were very able, and my little company had put in quite a bit of technical stuff. We still weren't doing the wet end of film printing. We still stayed in our color work with Kodak, because we were using Kodachrome as long as Kodachrome print stock was available. Ektachrome came on further, and it started to change things, and independent laboratories started out being able to process their own color film. So we made a change, and about that time, Dave Butler, who was my associate for all these years, was more interested in the creative side, in front of the lens type of thing. And I was always more interested in the nuts and bolts of sound recording and lab work and printing films and so forth. So at that time, Dave Butler had an opportunity to join the Wilding, the big industrial company from Chicago, representing them in Chicago. So he left my firm, and Palmer Films confined itself to just the post-production in film, which we've been doing ever since. But my own personal interest still stayed with the sound, and color was coming along. Incidentally, on the sound work for the Standard Hour, I was concerned that even the printing, the loss of printing from a negative to a positive of 16 millimeter might be too much of a loss. Keep in mind that this is a fine music program, and the high frequency response in 16 millimeter, to get 4,000 cycles on 16 millimeter is the equivalent of 10,000 cycles in 35. And just the act of contact printing from one film to the next, I felt might be a loss, and also the background level of 16 millimeter film was much higher than AM radio was inherently. Now, Standard Oil didn't know this at the time, and I didn't tell them, because I figured that before we had to go on the air, we had where to do it. We would be able to figure something out that would improve the sound. So it would seem to me that the way to do it was to do what is now regularly called electroprinting, that is to re-record from the magnetic to each print. Well, there's a problem in doing that onto a high contrast soundtrack of the variable area type. But there is an advantage in the density type in one sense, that the high frequencies are all middle tones. So the problems of high frequency response in variable area, or the cross-modulation problem of causing high frequencies in music and sibilants and voices and so forth to tend to have distortion, does not exist much in the variable density track. That's why the Western Electric system in the early days of Hollywood, before they really understood fully how to make a very good area track, the Western Electric densities always had nicer sibilant qualities of the voices. And even though inherently the signal-to-noise ratio of a density track of the traditional stuff is not as good as a variable area track, which was championed by RCA, of course, the density tracks all sounded nice and clean as far as speech was concerned. So I also then found that the Kodak made an emulsion that was very, very much finer grain than an ordinary positive film. It was a master positive, 7365, I think it was called in those days. It was a very fine grained film with a yellow dye to keep halation down, but it also was 1/10 the speed of ordinary positive film. so it needed a whale of a lot of light to expose it. And to try and record with a sound recorder directly onto that very slow film, it would require 10 times the light. And this sort of got me down for a while, but I had remembered seeing a paper in about 1939 that described a galvanometer that was made in Bell Telephone Laboratories. At the time, just before magnetic film became commonplace for the master, both RCA and Western Electric were experimenting with improved methods of making a master recording to record the original for later re-recording in photographic things. Dr. Frayne in Hollywood, who was the man who'd invented and worked out the light valve, which Western Electric has always used, was developing a 200 mil push-pull variable density system. But the Bell Telephone Laboratories, another arm of the Bell Telephone system, was working on a variable area 200 mil push-pull master recorder back in the East Coast. And I remembered seeing the article in the journal in which this galvanometer had a huge mirror, relatively speaking. The mirror is about the size of a 16 millimeter frame. So I knew that if such a modulator existed, it was like a projector. You could pull out plenty of light through it and get enough exposure. I also, by this time, had some knowledge of optics, so I figured I could develop a way in which I could use a modulator with this mirror and make a direct positive onto the final film. Now, on density, this is a bit of a problem because the inherent characteristics of film emulsion for a variable density track requires you to first make a negative, which follows the H&D curve, which is not linear. But when you print it into a positive, then it balances out, and if you work everything right, you come out with clean sound. But when you go directly to the original to play it back, you have to pre-distort it, and my system at that time, and with this standard hour, was to have an optical distorting method, pre-distorting, to follow the H&D curve. Actually, the part of the very high levels, light, the low densities, almost clear film, for a while, is pretty linear. So that could be fairly straight, but as you get into higher densities, you have to change the shape of the curve. Well, it was fairly easy to make an optical system that has a mask in it, which followed the H&D curve, and that's what I did for making these soundtracks. But every single print had to be a re-recording to the final print. And that was a little annoying because as we got ready to put it on the air, we were behind the schedule because Standard Oil had gotten into some problems with some of the copyright clearances. By the time they got tentative improvement when they recorded this stuff, but television was growing so rapidly that the copyright owners, like the Victor Herbert estate, suddenly decided that all the numbers that we'd done of Victor Herbert things couldn't be used. So I was having to, and John Corso was running the projection night, and I were the two guys who were trying to put these shows together and get them on the air in the 13 weeks. And there were several weeks that I didn't go home at all. I had a cot right in the studio and I was editing till I finally got the 6 copies that we needed, re-recorded on Saturday, got them to, at that time the processing was done by Dan Monaco, who was the father, of course, of Dick Monaco, and he still had his little laboratory in the basement of his home. And he would process these prints late Saturday night, and we'd ship them out Sunday for the next week's show. 13 weeks that was interesting, but I hope I never have to go through it again. Well, getting back to the interest in sound, this idea of electroprinting, that is, being able to put a soundtrack directly to the film, has very great advantages in some cases, particularly for answer prints, the first print off. Because you have to make a sound negative before you print it. That's a costly thing to do. And so often in the answer print of any production, you will have changes to make. So you may not, you don't like to put splices in a sound negative. So incidentally, I didn't complete my statement on the recorder that I thought about. I found out from Westrex by this time the government had forced Western Electric to divest themselves of the Western Electric recording system, and they changed the name to Westrex and sold it as an independent company. And they also had abolished their idea of only leasing equipment, which all the major studios had to do. When I inquired about this particular experimental galvanometer, I found that there had been only two made. One was in Goldwyn Studios, and the other one was in Columbia Pictures. And I found that the Columbia Picture recorder had been in use for some years, and in fact had just won the Academy Award for the sound on the Jolson story, the one that Larry Parks reenacting the starting of sound pictures with Al Jolson. I figured that if the galvanometer was good enough to win the Academy Award, it would be good enough to use for 16mm soundtracks. And also that Columbia had just then started to put in a new magnetic recorder, and the original 35mm D-spec recorder, as it's called, that's the original big, huge Western Electric design, was available. So I bought that from the Columbia Pictures and bought a brand new mechanical transport from Western Electric, combined the two, and made a recorder that did the electroprinting. Shortly thereafter, though, I decided that it would be desirable to try and do the electroprinting on variable area, because with all of its merits, the variable density system has some very definite disadvantages. By this time, film stocks had improved a great deal, and the knowledge of clearing up the cross-modulation that occurs between making a negative and a positive was better known. So was able to, with the help of Gordon Schaefer's, who's behind one of the TV cameras now, who was working for me at the time, we've constructed a cross-modulation compensator so as to be able to record directly onto the final print on electroprint without distortion. And we've been using it quite a bit ever since. But then another thing came on fairly recently, that color has become so complete that labs stopped even processing black and white. And to make a sound negative, the standard way is to use a special sound recording film. And in fact, a few years ago, about 10 now, Kodak developed a very much improved negative stock, 7373 it's called, which made a very much improved negative. That was fine, except we found nobody would process it. Allied, now Diner affiliated with Allied, they decided to stop processing altogether, as you probably know. And Monaco doesn't do any black and white at all. Well, about that time we put in our own color laboratory in San Francisco, doing both reversal and negative positive, but we also had one small black and white machine that we wanted to move from our basement where we were using it up into our new color lab, and for a while we couldn't develop black and white. So I was stuck how to make a black and white negative. So I thought, well, gee whiz, this color positive is really a marvelous film. It has almost twice the resolution of this brand new Eastman color negative, black and white special negative stock for sound. That has I think about a 92 lines per millimeter resolution, whereas colors positive, our ordinary positive stock, is about 200 lines per millimeter, twice as much resolution possibility. Why not see if we couldn't use the color stock as a negative? As you print the color negative, Kodak recommends that you use a minus blue filter, 21 filter. In other words, you don't use you cut out the blue, which is the third layer down, and it would be a little fuzzy anyhow. So I tried recording a negative on color positive with just the 21 filter and not applicating it. No silver in it at all, just dye. So I got a beautiful, sharp image of blue dye, and when you print that onto another positive through the same 21 filter, it has very high printing density. So we found that not only did the color positive work as a negative material very well, but it was really better because we could run our densities both on the negative and the positive higher. So we regularly are printing our printed color positives to a density of better than 2, whereas Eastman's recommendation is usually about 1.6, 1.7, or thereabout, which means that we get a very good signal-to-noise ratio and a good frequency response. Before we're ending, and I think I'll be able to wind up pretty fast now, I have a few more samples, but I will show almost everything you'll hear from now on is either printed from a dye negative, printed onto color positive, or it's electroprinted, and I can identify those as we go along. But there are other things that I have in mind that I'd like to show to you that I think are very good considerations for the 16 millimeter business, as much neglected as I think it has been recently. Neglected because the biggest use of 16 millimeter film for many years, that most of the years that we were in business, was for showing to club groups of various sorts, people of 50 to 100 people. People aren't making films for that purpose now. The big companies that made these public relations film are working almost entirely in video. And perhaps it's because it's just inconvenient to show video to large groups, or maybe they just don't have the need for the public relations use. But when you think of the many club groups that are meeting regularly, all the service clubs, Rotaries, Kiwanis, and so forth, retirement homes, all the religious groups and so forth, they're all groups that need a picture at least of this size, and it's still, although the video projectors are getting better, they're not easy to cart around and set up in a few minutes. I think the liquid crystal type projectors, when they're improved considerably, will take over quite a bit, but there's still a very good need for and use of film projection. And this comes back also to more use of the kinescope recording process, which I'm happy to say has improved a great deal recently because of several factors. Noteworthy is the new improved film stocks that Kodak has recently put in with this T grain. We're using now the 72-45 daylight emulsion to photograph off of a color tube, in our case a Trinitron high resolution, and it works very well indeed. Graininess is very low. We have other things that we've developed in the past working with kinescope recording to eliminate any visible scanning lines. Also, some processing equipment, particularly the Ferrugia laboratory down in Sunnyvale, has developed some wonderful black boxes that improve resolution without making it look too artificial. So all of those have increased the quality of transversum film. So when we get to these three developments, put them all together, and it has interesting potentials. That is, the three things is the use of color as a negative when you're making conventional negative positive, or electroprinting, where you don't want to and don't need to go through a negative, and if you only have 2 or 3 prints to make of a picture, it makes little sense to make a photographic negative if you can go directly to the final work. And finally, the combining film transfers from video with improved quality. So I have a few other samples that include some ideas that we've been working with. But first I want to show, I think I have to look at my notes to see I don't skip another one. Yeah. The next one up is a typical thing we get into on sound, particularly with young filmmakers. They don't like to follow the Hollywood lead, which, as you know, starts with fanfares and all hell breaking loose in the Paramount Public's type main title. Filmmakers very often like to start with crickets or birds or something very soft and create a mood. Well, this is fine, but then how's this poor projectionist going to know how to set the volume control, since 16mm projectors don't have very much of a standard? The poor guy who's running a film for the first time doesn't hear much, and so he keeps the volume higher and higher. Pretty soon he hears some noises of some sort. Actually, they were supposed to be crickets, but by now they'd sound like a herd of buffaloes in the distance. Then when the real sound comes in, it knocks the audience out of the chair. So we always encourage the filmmaker to put something at the beginning. You may not have to run it at the time you're showing the picture, but something so that the projectionist, when he's set up, has some little clue as to what is coming. So we had a picture a little while ago that I felt was really charming. The guy who produced it used his little boy, a son, and he wanted to start with a very delicate opening, and we made several tries at getting this subtle cricket background, the night scene, and we were losing it. Then I finally realized what was happening. In order to explain this, I have to go way back to a situation that has existed all during the 16mm field. When 16mm projectors were first designed, it was supposed that sound would always be recorded in 35mm and reduced, that the 16mm sound projector was only for a release. Nobody would be foolish enough to do what we young sprouts learned to do, record in 16mm directly. So the first sound projector was put on the market by RCA, and they decided that the film, the print, would always be B-wind. That is, the emulsion would always face the screen, which was the typical way that 35mm reduction print was made. They had, both Kodak and RCA developed a sound reduction printer, which would do that. So that was the status. When I first started making prints, I found that even on this Bay Bridge film, I really had to go through an intermediate a dupe negative to get my emulsion so it would play in focus with a Bell and Howell projector, which was then the criterion of the best projector. But as time went on, several of us who wanted to make contact prints actually would refocus some of our projectors so we could have a contact print or A-wind. Although until after the war, all my prints were made on an optical printer. I did that to keep my prints in the same fashion, as emulsion in the same process. But as time further went on, most of the projector manufacturers decided, well, to heck with this out of focus, in of focus. They'd focus the optics in the center of the film. So practically all 16-inch projectors made for 30 years were focused to a compromise position, focusing the optical system in the center of the film, so it was equally out of focus, A-bind or B-wind. The only company that ever regularly put out a sound focus on a projector, as many of you know, is the Eastman Kodak Paget. For 30 more years they made that model with a little lever. But they didn't label it sound focus. They called it fidelity control. So people didn't really know what it was for. It changed the sound, sure as did. Plus the fact that it always was in a slot that was too wide, so it would go way past focus in either direction. Kodak now sells an Elmo, made in Japan with a Kodak label. Very fine projector, but it's got a compromised focus. It's equally good or bad, as the case may be, with one side. Well, now what happens in that is that if you make a curve of recording a flat soundtrack with a out-of-focus lens system, and the lens systems of almost all projectors that I know of are little cylindrical lenses, very short focal length, but the characteristic is that when they go out of focus, the edges of the beam are sharp. What that means is that while it starts to lose high frequencies at about beyond 2,000 cycles, around 3,000, it starts to get that. It comes back in again when there's a place where the sharp edges are delivering multiples of a track. Then it goes out, then it comes back in. Many of you will recognize that as sort of a, what do you call it? The name escapes me. Glenn, you know. Well, at any rate, it's a series of things, each one decreasing. But if you get that curve of what happens in the low level, high frequencies on a soundtrack, it looks very much like the curve of the encoding of the Dolby B system. So we tried putting our sound through the Dolby B circuit, to lift the low level high frequencies dynamically. It does nothing when there's no high frequencies there, but as you know, the Dolby encoder lifts the high frequencies to get them up out of the noise level in the case of magnetic recording. Well, in the case of our optical soundtrack, this is lifting it up in a similar fashion. The decoding is done automatically by the out-of-focus projector. And it works surprisingly well. So I want to show you a piece of this little picture, which is the start of this man who made a movie of his son. This is just the opening, and it'll give you an idea of what we were able to accomplish. Okay, let's try trucking.
The wires will be hidden by insulation and plastic.
Oh boy, I forgot something else.
The electricians can return to attach the final devices and faceplates.
This is a sample of a negative, dye negative printed. Okay. hold it a moment, John. One comment I wanted to make about the use of the color stock as a negative has one technical flaw. The stock is a long pitch. Normally, those of you in the lab business know that a negative soundtrack is always short pitch. It's made so that when it winds around the sprocket of a printer, the shorter pitch follows the smaller contour, and then the raw stock that it's being printed on is a little bit longer. The ordinary positive that we've recorded this negative on is the same as the stock as a positive. And so it's long pitch. So you're printing long pitch to long pitch. The question is now, is that going to cause so much flutter that it makes it unusable? So this sample has some piano on the end. And if anything will show flutter, it'll be piano. And as far as my ears are concerned, was satisfactory. Now let's see if we can find the chucking opening. Now that's to set the level, the normal level. Well, a little boy wakes up, puts on his clothes, goes out to his father's big Kenworth, starts it up, and drives a very cleverly sequence in which they simulate the kid driving a truck with somebody hidden underneath actually doing the driving with a periscope or something. And he picks up his girlfriend and takes her for a ride and so forth. And it turns out, of course, it's all a dream. Very charming subject. Well, now I want to show some film which is broadcast quality material transferred to film, so to give you an idea of what our present status of transfer from video to film can look like. So let's run.
You fool, I said strumpet.
Well, what comes to my mind, and the point I want to make on this is that this is getting to the point that it rivals regular 16mm film, particularly in the closer shots. I don't think that the average person just seeing that would know whether its origination was video or film. So it, in my opinion, is completely feasible, as some of our customers have done, of mixing video and film, using the video when it really buys you something. For instance, if you're shooting dialogue, lip-synced, particularly interviews, something like that, where you may have to shoot a half hour's worth of material to get 2 or 3 minutes. Although Eastman would love you, to shoot color negative and all that, and have to print it all to see what you get, is rather costly. Whereas these days, the status of some of the cameras, now the Super VHS cameras and High 8, have broadcast quality if you stay in the component form. Don't go to NTSC, where then you can put it on 16mm film if you wish. So I want to show you a little piece that we did about a year ago for a reunion of some fighter pilots. And the fellow who put the show together was a fighter pilot in the Piston days, at the end of World War II, and he's kept in contact. So he takes the part of a guy who goes back to be retrained for jet fighter. And they had cooperation of the Top Gun school down in San Diego, and we intercut material from a VHS copy of Top Gun, a photoplay, with permission, and then some regular 16mm film that was staged down in the Top Gun place. See if you can detect what parts of this little skit are on film and which parts are originated on video. Incidentally, the video...
Since Mr. Sands was a Navy pilot, we felt it would be easy for him to complete the required survival training and to adapt to the high-speed environment of today's fighter aircraft arena. He was required to ride the Dilbert Dunker, a simulated crash at sea. This device gives our pilots training in escaping from a submerged aircraft in the inverted position.
No problem. Not at all.
Once in the water, the pilot is required to release his seatbelt and swim free of the downed aircraft.
Hey, come on, guys.
And of
Come
course,
on, fellas. Hey,
he has to become fully acquainted with the ejection seat system.
Hey, come on, put me down. Put me down. Put me down. Come on, I don't want to do this. Don't. No. No,
At
no,
today's
come
high
on.
speeds,
I don't
the
wanna do
ejection seat is necessary for a safe exit of the aircraft in an in-flight emergency.
Come on, guys. I don't think hey, I don't. No, I'm not gonna do this. I changed my mind. No.
The rugged landing gear.
Come on, leave me here. I want to look at this and go any further. Why don't you guys go off and do something? Have some fun, you know? Go march or do something like that. I don't want to do this. I got to stay here.
We were then ready to take to the air.
Come on, you guys.
I could tell he was eagerly looking forward to the flight.
I have to do this. Come on, guys.
After departing Naval Air Station Miramar, we climbed to 20,000 feet to engage the aggressor aircraft. We have recorded that action on film.
Okay, Mr. Sands. Are you strapped in tightly? I want to go home. I don't feel good. Don't worry. Just remember those days when you were a naval aviator. I've tried to forget those days. I had the highest laundry bill in the squadron. Why didn't you turn in your wings? I tried to, but my commanding officer said he wanted me around to use as an example of uncontrolled fear. Okay, there's the bandit at 10 o'clock. Do you see him? I can't see anything. I've got my eyes closed. Coming hard left to engage. Check your radar screen. We've got the bandit locked in. See it? No, my screen is picking up Willard Scott in the weather. He's reversing on us. Come hard right. Watch that G-force buildup. Hail Mary, full of grace. Uh-oh. Can you stop a minute? I dropped my rosary beads. Negative. No. Now he's pitching up on us. Here we go into afterburner. Uh-oh. Can I borrow a pair of undershorts from you? My cup run is over. Yeah, judging from the cockpit environment, I guess you might have experienced what we call high G stress.
Piper's coming down.
Can we go back to Miramar now? I think my office is calling me. Negative. No, the fun is just beginning. Yeah, we're right on his tail. We'll use a side order here. See that?
You're out of there, kid.
I can't see anything. My visor's fogged up.
Now this was an excerpt that was needed to sort of be a capsule version of his recording session, and it consisted of about a dozen different segments that I was to transfer from a VHS, incidentally, to begin with, to film and then edit the film, which of course is routine for us in the film business. But I figured that it would take about 2 weeks to do the job. By the time I transferred all the pieces, made a work print, edited the work print, then conformed the negative, then made a mix or dub, because many types of the sound had to do it. The idea was well laid out, worked out by the first trumpet player of the orchestra that this was to be used with as part of a concert. But I said 2 weeks minimum I'd need to be sure of getting it. He wanted it right now, of course. I said the only way to do it is to do it in video first, edit it together. That can be done fast, and as a film person, I hate to admit it. But when you really want fast speed in editing, you can do it in video and do a remarkable job. This was done, I was amazed, in less than 3 hours. by Jim Draper at McEwen, taking the VHS and editing it to a 3/4 inch, making use of both tracks, putting some of the audio on one track and some on the other, and then all I had to do in transferring to the full coat 16 millimeter and making a transfer was a one shot, and combining the two tracks. He had already faded down in the segue, and so I just want to conclude with that because I think it's entertaining. It also shows what can happen is quite a few transfers. I have no idea, of course, how many transitions it went to before it got on the VHS cassette. It was made by the Maisel brothers, and it's dedicated to one of the brothers who died. But I think he was one of the things. So it was shot on 16 millimeter film. I'm pretty sure it was edited in video to begin with. Then the VHS was edited to 3/4 inch. The 3/4 inch was put into 16 millimeter. The soundtrack each time was going through all these various things, and the soundtrack on the VHS was just ordinary linear soundtrack as it comes to for your home use. But the electroprinting, I think, will give you an idea of what quality we generally get. So let's West Side Story.
Back in 1949, Jerome Robbins, with whom I'd worked, called me up with a terrific idea. He was wildly excited. A Broadway show based on Romeo and Juliet. I thought this was a very exciting idea. He had a notion that it should be based on street warfare in the New York slums. Now, have you know, I know this piece very well. I didn't used to till this week. But because I've never conducted it in my life, and I've never studied the score till now, I had to study it every day and every night for the last 10 days. I think it's so funky. I can't get over how funky this piece is. I do it over and over. We do takes, we rehearse, and I listen to playbacks. I come back and do it again, and I don't get sick of it. That's a sign of something fresh. I mean, it's not fresh the way Mozart stays fresh time after time. But that's, who's in that class? None of us.
The interpretation is fantastic in that he pulls things out and puts them in. But the funniest thing of all, when he suddenly just started just conducting and he just said, that's the tempo, that's it. And I sort of laughed because that was like having Mozart with you. Or bring Handel back. He says, that's what I wanted, that's the tempo and that's how it shall be. And you were getting it from the master himself.
Okay. The only comment I have is, strangely enough, you wouldn't think I'd have any comment for strings in a piece like this, but I do, that the articulation, when you have tu-ta-ta-ru, tu-tau, tu-tu-ta-ru, tu-tau, tau, tau, out there places where I don't hear that articulation from you the way I hear it from brass people. And it's important, otherwise I wouldn't have written string parts for this. It's not just a jazz band, in other words.
That's true. Whenever it gets really jazzy, the strings just tend to give up. And
in spite of the fact that we have this great genius for his trumpet playing, we still need the son as an octave higher, and so on. Okay. Still same take. We're rolling.
75.
I mean...
I know that's fine,
The rest.
To start here, please.
Oh, come on. You did wonderfully. No, I mean, Q was changed to play, and my red pencil. 4 o'clock in the fucking morning I was up doing this. Why don't you deliver these messages?
Henry, would you rather do this tomorrow?
Well...
Because the session's over.
Oh, well, then. Okay.
All right,
That's
now look, everyone. For tomorrow evening, looks like you'll be free. If we need anything, we'll do it a little after 5. We'll go overtime tomorrow. So you're free tomorrow evening.
I can hardly believe it. Wait, hold on. I don't either. Oh, God, such problems. That's all.
Are you exhausted?
If you want to know the difference between yesterday and today, I look at your camera and say, judge for yourself. You see a difference? You see a tired, aging maestro, where yesterday you saw a tired, aging maestro, but less tired, less aging. One more time from the top.
Maria, take 125.
Maria. The most beautiful sound I ever heard. Maria, 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 Maria. All the beautiful sounds of the world in a single word. Maria, 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 Maria. I've just met a girl named Maria, and suddenly the name will never be the same to me.
That was the music I grew up on, the music that I loved, that I could relate to as young boy, young girl, love and all that sort of thing, and parents not allowing it. And I think I was going through the same sort of torments myself when I was very young. And I sort of related myself to the young girl, but then the music was so lovely, and of course I was in love with a young man who played the piano and could play this music like heaven, I thought. And I would sing it along with him, and we just go around singing it all over the place. And for me, it meant a very vital time in the young love in my life. And now when I'm doing it with this genius, I just can't believe that all that music oozed out of that man to give us this, and everyone else dancing in the studio such a long time after it's composed.
Although the song Somewhere is not sung by Maria, but is sung by an offstage voice during the ballet in the second act, I couldn't resist, once I was working with Kitty, hearing her sing this song, which is one of my favorite songs in the show. And so we made a take of it, even though in the final recording, the song was recorded by Marilyn Horne. At the beginning of this project, I was not all that secure about what was going to happen. It was an extraordinary idea. I thought it might, for one thing, seem dated. It is 50s music. And what I have found, out of all that insecurity, is a tremendous feeling of security. This poetic language of Jets and Sharks that was created by Arthur Lawrence is something truly poetic in the sense that it lasts the way a poem lasts. I feel that it is a piece that is, in its funny little crazy way, a classic.
Come to the back door.
Si.
Tony, what does Tony stand for?
Answer.
Ti adoro, Anton.
Ti adoro, Maria.
Thank you. Thanks for your patience. I hope I've been able to get a few of my enthusiastic feelings about the future. I wish to heck I had another 50 years. I expect to be around for a little bit more, but not quite that much. I thank you very much.
That was great, Bill. Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. You gave us a truly memorable evening, took us through a lot of history, and introduced us to the future as well.